Magical salvation on Yom Kippur. There are stories in our house that are passed down from generation to generation, like precious family heirlooms. One of them is the story of how my father miraculously survived the most difficult and dangerous moments of wartime. This story is not just a memory. It is filled with pain, fear, hope, and most importantly, the deep faith that my father carried throughout his entire life. In the life of every person, there are moments when the past, present, and future merge into a single moment filled with hope, fear, and endless faith. This happened once with my father, on the very day when the ancient words of David's Psalms became his talisman, and the family tradition, passed down from generation to generation, regained its strength. My father, Beryl Ianovich, served in army intelligence during the war with the fascists. His stories about those days always filled the house with special awe and respect. One of the most amazing episodes took place on the holy day of Yom Kippur, and this day remained a symbol of miracle and salvation for our family for the rest of our lives. The operation in which my father and his two comrades participated was very dangerous. In those days, the city was shrouded in anxiety, and every step could be the last. After fierce battles, army units liberated another city from occupation. However, there was still a danger. Could enemy groups be hiding somewhere, ready to strike the liberators in the back? It was with this task, to make sure that the fascists had really left the city, that a reconnaissance group was sent, which included my father and two other soldiers. 3 scouts, inspecting the neighborhoods, reached a tall building. Having climbed onto the roof, they hoped to see the entire area from above and make sure that there was no enemy. But, as it turned out, the danger was closer than it seemed. The building, the windows and doors were blocked with sandbags on all sides, and the only one, a blank wall without a single window opening, looked into the void. On the roof of the abandoned building, among broken glass and rusty beams, a group of tired people in gray uniforms were preparing for an operation on which not only their fate, but also the future of the entire detachment depended. The plan was simple on paper, but in reality, almost impossible to implement. Having no right to make a mistake, the scouts had to conduct surveillance, determine the exact positions of the enemy, pass the coordinates to the commander and, if lucky, save lives by leaving the danger zone. Beryl and his reconnaissance group were surveying the area from the roof of a low building when he suddenly noticed a large group of fascists. They went into the lower floor of the very building on the roof of which our scouts were located. The situation was extremely dangerous. The fascists did not suspect that an enemy reconnaissance group was located right above them, but they could discover it at any moment. The dim light of dawn barely illuminated the wet concrete roof. 4 scouts, having climbed to the top of the abandoned building, hid near a low partition, listening to the rumble of distant shots and the alarming rustle of the wind. At their disposal were only weapons, a compact radio, a couple of bandages and several dry rations, a standard set for a short sortie that suddenly turned into a protracted standoff. In the last hours, the situation changed rapidly and irreversibly. The group entered the building unnoticed, taking advantage of the darkness on the streets. The first floors seemed empty, only the echo of footsteps accompanied their path to the stairs leading up. On the roof, the scouts planned to conduct surveillance, determine the enemy's positions and, ideally, safely leave the facility. The order to surround the facility came from the other end of the radio, in a hoarse, decisive voice that brooked no argument. Below, in the alleys, the soldiers maneuvered carefully, hiding behind walls and garbage containers. Their goal was clear: to ensure the safety of the group on the roof and to prevent the enemy from appearing from a side that they could not see from either the roof or the ground. Everything was based on desperation and a subtle faith. If they managed to save those on the roof, then there would be a chance to change the course of events, and if not, then they would only be remembered as those who did not lose hope until the very end. The soldiers chose a place to maneuver, retreating further from the power lines. Nearby stood 2 massive pillars, like guards separating darkness and light. With their hands, to the roar of distant explosions, they pulled a huge tarpaulin between them, sometimes trembling from gusts of wind, sometimes from internal tension. The tarpaulin became not only a shelter, but also a kind of trap for air, for hope, for a chance to save. The soldiers chose a place to maneuver, retreating further from the power lines. Nearby stood 2 massive poles, like guards separating darkness and light. With their hands, to the roar of distant explosions, they pulled a huge tarpaulin between them, sometimes trembling from gusts of wind, sometimes from internal tension. The tarpaulin became not only a shelter, but also a kind of trap for air, for hope, for a chance to save. The idea was crazy, and only desperation and the desire to save lives allowed them to believe in its feasibility. The soldiers, risking themselves, pulled the massive tarpaulin between the two poles with their hands, choosing a place further from the power lines, so that if something went wrong, they would not be damaged by high-voltage wires. The tarpaulin became a kind of air trap, fragile, but the only hope for salvation. The father and his two comrades, young men who had already seen a lot, stood on the roof of the building. The height was considerable, and below, far under their feet, through the network of wires, the wind fluttered the edges of the tarpaulin. Each of them had to take a step into the unknown, a step that could be their last. But there was no other way out. The soldiers near the tarpaulin froze, waiting for the command. Their task was not just to create a shelter, it was necessary to do everything so that, if necessary, the tarpaulin could withstand the fall of people from the roof. In the dark silence, someone prayed, someone remembered their relatives, someone simply clenched their fists so as not to tremble. On the roof, as if on cue, the scouts moved to the edge, checking the fastenings and calculated points for the jump. It seemed that everything around froze, even the wind stopped its dances, giving way to heavy, anxious anticipation. The descent began. The first jumped, deftly sliding along the rope, the second followed him, the third lingered, checking the path. Each jump was a struggle with the height, with fear, with those minutes that could be the last. The tarpaulin stretched, creaked, withstood. Those who found themselves below hurried to help, support, hide from the enemy's sight. Before the jump, my father, according to him, felt the weight of time as never before. He remembered his father, my grandfather Jonah, a man for whom the words of David's psalms were not just a prayer, but a part of life. In their family, it was customary to read 3 special psalms on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when the soul seeks the path to light and forgiveness. My father took an old, tattered piece of paper from his pocket. Those very psalms were written on it. Before jumping, he began to read aloud the lines that had saved his family from trouble more than once. His voice, trembling and tense, sounded almost solemn, as if connecting the past and the present at one point. The first to jump was his friend, a strong, short guy who always joked even in the most difficult situations. The second, tall and silent, able to instill confidence with just one look. My father jumped last. At that moment, there was silence all around, broken only by the hum of the city and the distant crackle of wires. The jump was incredibly difficult. It was necessary not only to calculate the trajectory and hit the stretched tarpaulin, but also to avoid dangerously hanging electric wires, which seemed to be deliberately blocking the way. All 3 jumped, and the tarpaulin held. My father's comrades remained unharmed, only slightly confused by the sudden landing. However, my father, as if fate decided to test him once again, at the moment of the jump, his face touched one of the wires. A sharp pain and a sudden flash before his eyes reminded him of the price of salvation. The scar left on his face became not just a mark on the body, but a sign of that day when prayer, faith, and courage intertwined. The operation lasted a few minutes, but for the participants, time stretched out to infinity. When the group left the dangerous territory, the commander gave the signal on the radio, "Tanks, fire!" At that moment, the roar became all-consuming. Tanks opened fire on the building, turning concrete, glass, and metal into a whirlwind of debris and dust. Those who had recently been standing on the roof watched from cover, realizing that their salvation was the result of a desperate plan that had worked against all odds. My father told us that he mentally repeated the lines of the 3 psalms that his grandfather Jonah had taught him. These psalms were always read in our house on Yom Kippur, the day when, according to Jewish tradition, a person seeks reconciliation with himself and with God. That day, everything coincided: danger, prayer, and the miracle of salvation. My grandfather used to say, "These words are like a bridge between the past and the future. They lead to the light even in the darkest times." The family tradition of reading the 3 ancient psalms has become an integral part of our lives, and the scar on my father's face is a silent witness to the fact that prayer can sometimes change the course of events. The salvation happened on Yom Kippur, when, according to faith, the heavens are especially close to the earth, and prayer can be heard. For our family, this day became a double holiday, a holiday of life and faith, a holiday of remembrance that even in the most difficult moments one should not lose hope. After that day, my father often repeated that if it were not for the Psalms, if it were not for the words put into his heart by his grandfather, perhaps everything would have turned out differently. The scar remained, but the life saved that day became the greatest gift for the family, for comrades, for everyone who believes in miracles. The story of my father's salvation has become part of our family history. Every year, when Yom Kippur comes, we read those same psalms again, remembering the story of the jump, the scar, and faith. My father says, "A scar is not only a memory of pain, it is a sign of life and strength." And every prayer becomes gratitude for salvation, for tradition, for the opportunity to move on. This day will forever remain in our memory as a symbol of the fact that faith, passed down from generation to generation, is able to support in the most critical moments. And the scar on my father's face is a reminder of how his life was saved. When Yom Kippur comes, the air is filled with a special silence, and time seems to slow down, allowing everyone to immerse themselves in reflection and repentance. For me, this day has always been associated with a special story that intertwined light and darkness in the life of my family. Many years ago, on one of the Yom Kippurs, when the city was enveloped in golden autumn light and prayers filled the synagogues, my father found himself on the brink of life and death. But a miracle happened. My father was saved on that very day when the whole world freezes in the face of eternity. Yom Kippur became the day of his salvation, the day of his second birth. The years passed. My father lived as if anew, filling every moment with care, wisdom, and joy. But time is inexorable. And then Yom Kippur came again, the day when the city falls silent in anticipation of forgiveness, when hearts are open and the soul trembles. On this day, many years after that salvation, my father passed away quietly and calmly, as if dissolved in evening prayer. Yom Kippur became for him not only the day of salvation, but also the day of departure, when hope and farewell merged into one. Now Yom Kippur for me is the memory of a miracle and loss, of life and destiny. This is the day when I remember my father, his strength and humility, his bright gaze, full of gratitude for every moment he lived. On this day, I feel how his story lives in me, like the breath of autumn, like the rustle of the pages of a prayer book, like the light of candles burning as a sign of memory and eternal love. Psalm 27, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." This psalm begins with words that have become a symbol of hope and trust in the Almighty. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Tea is traditionally read at the beginning of the month of Elul, the period of preparation for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and continues throughout the days of trembling. In the psalm, David shares his worries and fears, but his entire prayer is imbued with confidence in the protection and mercy of God. On Yom Kippur, this text helps the worshippers remember that light and salvation come only from the Almighty. The psalm sounds like a personal confession of trust and hope, despite the difficulties around them. One of the verses says, "One thing have I asked of the Lord, this will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life." Reading this psalm on Yom Kippur reminds us of the highest goal, not only about forgiveness, but also about the desire to come closer to the divine, to live every day in the presence of holiness. Psalm 33, "Blessed is he whose iniquities are forgiven." Psalm 3:3 is one of the key texts on repentance and forgiveness. David glorifies the happiness of those whose sins are forgiven, who open their souls before the Lord. Blessed is he whose iniquities are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. This psalm reflects the deep psychology of repentance. David describes the painful experiences of someone who hides his sins, and the liberation that comes with confession and repentance. On Yom Kippur, this text is read to emphasize that forgiveness is possible if a person is honest with himself and God. The psalm teaches that openness and sincerity are the path to spiritual healing. "I acknowledged my sin to you, and did not hide my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin." During the day of Yom Kippur, when the words vidui, a collective confession of sins, are heard, Psalm 33 helps those praying accept responsibility for their actions and experience the joy of forgiveness. Psalm 130, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord." Psalm 130, or Shir Hamalot, is one of the most touching and intimate texts. David addresses the Almighty from the depths of despair. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications." This psalm expresses hope for mercy even when a person feels distant from God. It reminds us that no chasm is too great to be overcome with prayer and repentance. The psalm is often read during Nila, the final prayer of Yom Kippur, when the doors of mercy are still open and the last requests for forgiveness ascend to heaven. If you, O Lord, mark iniquities, who, O Lord, can stand? But there is forgiveness with you, that they may fear you. This psalm inspires faith in the possibility of forgiveness and renewal, even if the path has been difficult and full of mistakes.